Hi everyone, it's Rachel, and in this video I'll be showing you how to make some red lentil dal. If you've never made dal before, at first it can seem a little daunting, but once you do it a couple of times, it's actually a very simple process, and the recipe can be very varied depending on your dosha, the season, or even just your taste. So the recipe I'll be using today is in the resources section for this course, and I'll be making the pitta pacifying dal, but you can really use any spices that you like, and the process is the same. Before I start cooking, I like to assemble my ingredients, especially if it's something new that I've never prepared before. And so this might seem like a lot of stuff. It's mostly just because there's a lot of spices and maybe there's a few tools that are new for you. Depending on whatever recipe you're following, if you're not going to be following the pitta pacifying recipe, just gather the spices that you'll need. But in general, what you'll need is some red lentils, a mesh container, just like when making rice, to rinse the lentils. I'm going to be using some ginger root, and so I'll use this grater to freshly grate the ginger, and then ghee or olive oil or sunflower oil, the spices that you'll need, a measuring cup, measuring spoons, and any kind of condiments that you want to use at the end. It can be nice to garnish the dal with some fresh cilantro, some black sesame seeds, some extra ghee, different things like that. So whatever you need, you can just have it available. Just like with the rice, you're going to want to rinse the lentils, and I make sure to rinse the lentils for even longer than I rinse the rice, and you'll see why in a second. So for this recipe, I'm going to be using about half a cup of red lentils. And I'll bring it up to the camera so that you can see how bubbly the lentils get. And when you're rinsing, you'll see it almost looks like they're soapy. There's a lot of bubbles that come up off the lentils. And so you really want to make sure to rinse until all of those bubbles clear, because those bubbles are gas. And you may have noticed that lentils and beans give you gas. And so there it is, there's the bubbles. And so by rinsing, we're going to decrease the amount of gas that will escape from the lentils into your abdomen. So we're just, getting the farts out now. So give them a real good rinse. I like to flip them over a couple of times. Sometimes even use my hands. And you'll see that the water is a little reddish. And so you really want to rinse the lentils, especially if you are prone to gas or any kind of abdominal discomfort when eating lentils or beans. You want to make sure to give them a real good rinse. And some people will even soak them overnight, and that can really help to make them more digestible. Just like with the rice too, while you're rinsing, you want to make sure that there's no rancid smell. The lentils can go bad just like rice can, and just like any kind of food. So if there's any kind of weird smell that doesn't smell good to you, then they're probably not good. All right, so that's looking less soapy to me. And as you can see, I've been rinsing them for a couple of minutes. And voila. Once I've rinsed the lentils, now I've put them in a pan with 2.5 cups of water. So that's half a cup of red lentils with 2.5 cups of water. And I'm gonna have a little dish here to the side that's handy with a spoon, because as the lentils heat up, I have them on a pretty high heat right now. Some foam's gonna come off. These are just little, I'm not sure what those are. Sometimes you'll see it's like the chaff from the grain. So I'm getting those out. But as they start to cook and the water heats up before it boils, you'll see some more bubbles rise to the surface. And again, that's the gas that can cause bloating and pain. So we skim that out before the lentils start to boil. So while the water's heating up, I'm gonna go back over and measure out my spices ahead of time so that I'm not panicking when it's time to put them in. So now I'm back at my spice station. And frequently in Ayurvedic cooking, when we're using seeds, so these are cumin seeds, we'll put them in with the oil before we put in the powders. And the reason we do that is that the seeds are covered with essential oils. And so we want to get those essential oils into the cooking oil so that that cooking oil then coats whatever it is we're cooking with the oil with the essential oils from the seeds. So this recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of cumin seeds. So I'm going to put them in a little dish so they're just ready to go when it's time. And then the next part of the spice mix that comes after the cumin seeds is a 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric. And I'm running a little low here. You can tell that turmeric is very popular at my house. So I'm doing a 1/4 teaspoon of the turmeric. I really enjoy the smell of fennel, so I took some fennel seeds in my pestle and mortar and ground them up. And we'll talk about this in the course, but part of using spices is to enjoy the process of cooking, to make the process of cooking therapeutic. And fennel is one of my favorite spices to cook with. It's very difficult to find it pre-ground. You can also use like a coffee grinder. I wouldn't use the same grinder that you use for coffee for spices. I would get a separate grinder, but same thing. You just put the seeds in the grinder and then they grind up into a powder, and it's much stronger and it's much tastier than if you buy the powders. But fennel in particular is hard to find the powder, so I just kind of crushed them up. And as you can see, they're still pretty seedy, so it's not totally a powder, and that's really like a preference thing. But when you start, so this was 1 teaspoon, or I'm sorry, yes, it was 1 teaspoon of fennel seeds. And then when I grind them up, now it's going to be more. So it's created a little bit more. So there'll be a little bit of extra. And I really like fennel, so I'm just putting it all in. All right, so 1 teaspoon of ground-ish fennel seeds. 2 teaspoons coriander powder. Wow, I'm running low on all of my spices because I love them and I've been cooking like crazy. Ooh, I have just enough. 2 teaspoons coriander powder. There's more where that came from. And then for the ginger, it says about 1/2 teaspoon of grated ginger, which, so as you can see, this little nub is about the size of my thumbnail. Everybody's different, but that's about, once we grind it, it's going to be about a teaspoon. So I'm going to cut that off. And if you've never seen one of these graters before, they're great. They're awesome. And they can really help make a nice fine grate. If you don't have one of these, it's also fine to mince the ginger really fine. But I'm going to show you a little trick with peeling the ginger that you might not know first. So before I cut that little piece off, I'm going to peel it with a spoon. And so if you've never seen this before, like using a knife, you'll end up cutting most of the ginger that you want to use off, and it can be a real pain. Ginger's kind of a weird shape. So when you use the spoon, it just peels right off. And I like to keep it attached because it just makes it easier to handle. And especially if the ginger's organic, you don't have to peel it. It's a preference thing. So if it's not like perfectly peeled, that's okay. That's like, a gnarly piece right there. So I'm just peeling that little nub off. And again, based on your preference and your flavor, you might want to add a little more ginger. Fresh ginger has different qualities than powdered ginger. So without really knowing much about it, you can just use your intuition and understand that it's juicy, it's wet, which is going to be very different than dry. So if you're having issues with dryness, you'll go more towards fresh ginger. Or if you're having a lot of mucus, then you're gonna go more towards dry ginger. So I'm using some fresh ginger today. So I've got that part peeled and I can smell the ginger. It's really, really nice smell when you peel it that way. And now I'm gonna grate it into the spice mix. So I'm gonna cut this little piece off and just grate it right into my spice mix. And these graters are very sharp, so you do need to watch out for your fingers. And then also, if you're doing this while you're watching the video, enjoying the smell, enjoying the way the ginger feels under your fingers. And the back will usually have some extra stuff there. I'm going to keep this little nub and I'm going to just cut it up and add that in, have some nice chunks. Okay, now let's check on those lentils. Right on cue, the lentils are getting bubbly, so I'm just gonna skim off those bubbles. And if this is your first time making dahl, sometimes you might want to just measure out the spices before you even put the lentils on the stove, because there can be that moment where you're messing around with your measuring spoons and the spices, and then the lentils are boiling, and then you're like, cooking is hard. So it can be nice to just do one thing at a time so that the process feels meditative and pleasant. Even here, just enjoying the smell of the lentils, letting it be a nice creative process of skimming the foam off the top. And you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. There's always going to be a little bit of foam left. If you find you're especially sensitive to the lentils, try soaking them at night and then rinsing them pretty thoroughly after they're soaked. And that should eliminate some of the foam. Once it starts bubbling, then a lot of the lentils are going to be rising to the surface, so you don't want to be scooping them out too. So I think that's a good amount of foam that I got right there. Oops. Jeez, sorry, I didn't realize that my video moved. Not sure what happened there. There's the foam. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. But here we are. So now I've got most of the foam scooped off, and I've turned the heat down now so that it's on a low boil. I'm just gonna skim a little bit more here. And then you don't need to stir the lentils, just kind of keep an eye on them. It takes about 15 minutes for them to soften up. And so this might be a time where if you want to cook some vegetables or something to go along with your lentils, you might do that. As you can see, next to the lentils, I've got a cast iron pan. So that's where I'm going to cook the spices. That's called a sabji, and we'll do that next. And then after the lentils have been cooked, we put the sabji in there. And so I'll show you that next. Okay, so the lentils have been cooking for about 10 minutes, and as you can see, the consistency is pretty watery. So that's the proportions of 1/2 cup to 2.5 cups of water. So if you want it to be a little thicker than that, you can always add less water. I would say start with 2 cups of water. The purpose of making it really soft like this is that it'll just make it easier to digest. And as I'm looking at the lentils, you know, they're still formed, and so I'm going to keep the heat on and cook them a little longer and make them really soft. And so especially if you are prone to getting bloating or gas, the longer you cook them, the easier they'll be to digest. So that's on a low heat. It's been about 10 minutes. I'm going to let them cook a little longer. And I'm going to start by making the sabji. So it's 2 teaspoons of oil, and I've been cooking long enough that I just kind of go like this with a knife with the ghee. But if you want to measure it out, you can, especially if you know that you have some issues with digesting oil. Then you want to be really careful about how much oil you're adding, and using olive oil or sunflower oil will be better, especially if you are really prone to pitta type disorders. I'm using ghee because I love the way that it tastes. So I've got the heat on the pan and I'm going to let the ghee melt. If you're using something more like oil, then you'll just put it in the pan and let it heat up, but you don't want to let it get too hot, because when the oil gets too hot, it changes the composition of the oil and makes it harder to digest. So just enough so that it's warm in the pan. For the ghee, I'm going to let it melt. Let it coat the pan. You don't have to use a cast iron pan, but any kind of frying pan that you have will work just fine for this process. And actually a smaller pan is better than a larger pan, and you'll see why for what we're going to do in a second. We're going to make a paste. All right. So once that's melted and warm, then I'm going to add the cumin seeds first, like I said, so we can get the essential oils from the cumin seeds into the ghee. And I'm just going to rotate them around. Use a spatula to get all the seeds coated with oil, and I'm going to let them cook for just about 30 seconds. You don't want to burn them, so I've got the heat on a lower heat, low to medium. They're starting to sizzle. I don't know if you can hear that on the video, but I'm going to wait until I can smell them. If your sense of smell is disturbed, it's hard to smell them, then you might just even set a little timer or look at your clock and just kind of give them a nice roast for about 30 seconds to a minute so that you're gently browning them. And I'm moving them around so that they don't burn. But I want to also keep them kind of flat so that all of them are getting a little bit of heat. So now I'm starting to smell them. And once I smell them, now I'm going to add the rest of the spices. And cooking the spices first is just going to unlock some of their secret powers and also make them more digestible. So this is why you can see using a smaller pan is better, because you don't want to be spreading it around the pan too much. I want to really make sure I get all the oil mixed in with the spices, so I make kind of a paste out of the spices. I try to keep them sort of consolidated. And again, I'm just going to cook that 30 seconds, not very long. I can smell it. It smells delicious. Anybody who's living in your house or comes over to visit your house is just going to be like, oh my gosh, your house smells amazing. So if for some reason your house smells bad, just make a sabji. All will be resolved. Or I know another person who's a real estate agent. Every time she sells a house, she makes either cooks onions or makes something like this before she does an open house. And then everybody says, oh my gosh, it smells so good in here. All right, so now I've turned that off. And I'm going to take this and put it in there. It smells so good. There we go. Really take a deep breath. Just put it into the lentils to enjoy that smell. Give it a nice mix, and then we'll cook that a few more minutes. And I'm adding the salt now. Part of the reason we do the salt now is that if you do the salt earlier with beans and lentils, that can also tend to hold in some of the gases that need to come out. So we always add salt last when we're cooking lentils and beans. And this is where if you were adding a little fresh chopped cilantro, you would add that as well. You can also use it as a garnish on top. And then I'm just going to let that cook a few more minutes. And there you have it. Some nice, simple red lentil dal. You can eat it alone or with rice or any other grain that you enjoy. It can be nice to add some vegetables or just eat it plain, depending on what you enjoy. So enjoy.